Okay, we're ready. So whenever you'd like to start.
Great. Well, hello, Scott. It's great to be with you today, this afternoon. My name is Timothy Patrick McCarthy, and I am a faculty member at Harvard University, where I teach in the Graduate School of Education and at the Kennedy School of Government.
Hi, Tim. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'm very excited to have you. And we just recently had a course together, which was
Yes.
fantastic. Brave communication, and yeah, and I just feel like having the opportunity to tell so many of my own stories while also learning from the stories of my classmates and also your stories. I just knew that at some point we would have this opportunity because I wanted more of the spotlight on you to hear about the many accomplishments, the trials and tribulations, right? The excitement of just what you've been able to do at Harvard and beyond. And so yeah, so we're here in this space to talk a little bit about you, but also how that ties into this concept of global citizenship. And
Mhm.
so thank you so much for making the time. And we'll start with a very general question, just to kind of get things started. It's about your professional background, and so sharing a few milestones, maybe significant events or encounters with people who really marked you and guided you
Mhm.
to, where you are now at Harvard.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Yeah, and I loved our work together in the class in the fall, and I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity for us to be in dialogue and to share a bit more deeply. When I think about my professional life or my personal life, what I've become over time, I have to go back to the roots of how I grew up, and I was raised in a working class immigrant stock background. My grandparents were immigrant factory workers, and one of them was a public school teacher, a trailblazing educator. My parents were both public school teachers, and most of the people in their generation, the generation before, did not have access to the same kinds of formal education that my grandmother had, who was a teacher, my parents and I certainly have had over the years. But yet it was a home that may not have always had people who were formally well educated, but folks who were really worldly in terms of their own ideas and their thoughts and their perspectives and their analysis of what was going on in the world. They were hardworking folk. They had lots of opinions. We were a kind of family that, there's a saying that you don't talk about religion or politics at the dinner table. We always talked about both of those things plus sports. So it was a lively time to break bread every time we got together. And I was, raised, I think, in a kind of social justice Catholic tradition, a tradition that valued respect for other people, to treat and love your neighbor as yourself. There was a heavy emphasis on peace and nonviolence, of sharing, of mutual aid, of redistribution of resources, and making sure that everybody had what they needed, not just to survive, but to thrive. And so we weren't fancy people, but we didn't aspire to be fancy people either. And I think that that kind of education, the moral education that I got, and the social justice values, and the sort of prioritization, the value that was placed on education, that I benefited from enormously. And then those ideas about peace and mutuality, uh, um, and respect and love were things that really animated me. So that's what formed me. That was the kind of incubator from which I emerged when I got the opportunity to go to a very fancy school. I used to joke that I was a blue collar kid who went to a white collar school when I got accepted to Harvard in the spring of 1989. I could talk more about sort of that particular historical moment and how important that was in shaping my ideas about what it meant to live a good life, what it meant to be a global citizen, what I was responsible for, and who I was responsible to. But I think about my professional life when I think about my adulthood. I think that I've done sort of three types of things. One is as a scholar, two is as a teacher, educator, and then three as an activist, an organizer. And so when I think about the way that I've tried to live my life, and there's been never been a strategic plan. I joke all the time. I mean, I'm an out gay adult now, middle-aged, mid-career, and I like to joke that there's really nothing straight in my life, but there certainly is no straight line from the place I was when I was a kid to where I am now as a middle-aged, mid-career adult. And so it's a little bit messy, and that's okay. But when I think about if I want to put myself into buckets or try to sort through it and clean up the mess a bit, I think that the scholar, educator, teacher, and activist are the sort of things that I've devoted my life to. And when I think about being a scholar, I'm trained as a historian. I got a PhD in history, particularly the history of social movements in the United States, with a focus initially on African American history and interracial social movements, and then more broadly other kinds of social movements, including the LGBTQ movement and the labor movement and various forms of American radicalism. And so I was trained in that kind of intellectual climate. And so as a result, history is very important to me. Everything is kind of rooted in history. Even my answer to this question, right? I went back to my roots. I often do that. I always go back to the kind of origin story and then figure out what the evolution story is. And whether it's just trying to figure out my own life or think about how we figure out the world. And so being a historian, studying change over time, looking at factors, causal factors that create conflict or contention or change or transformation, that's really important to me. And I've spent most of my life in my research and my writing and even my teaching focused on those matters. When it comes to teaching as an educator, I mean, I come from teachers. I come from, I'm the third generation of teachers and educators in my family, and I love teaching. I think about teaching, I mean, you were in my class. I love teaching because I'm always learning, right? No matter who's in my class, every semester I have all of these people who are teaching me things that I'm learning from, and I'm able to share whatever I know, and we can put those things in conversation and come up with something new. We can build something together, whether it's knowledge or community or respect. And to me, the classroom is a sacred space, a place where we need to feel respected, where we need to feel safe and feel like it's a kind of holding space for our humanity. Also a place that should be a brave space and a critical space, a place where we can grow, where we can be challenged, where we can challenge each other, where we can listen to different opinions, and then also hopefully develop some sense of common purpose together. And so for me, teaching and education, no matter where I'm doing it, I do my day jobs at Harvard, but I do a lot of other kinds of teaching. I teach in high schools and I've taught in middle schools. I've taught in prisons. I teach at a community health center in Dorchester in Boston. It's a college humanities program for lower income adults. I've been teaching in for almost 25 years. So I do a lot of different kinds of teaching. And for me, no matter where I am, whether it's a prison or a community center or a classroom at Harvard, to me, teaching is the most sacred of professions. And then when I think about activism, which is, I think, for a lot of academics, is something that is either something you want to avoid or steer clear of, or something that you compartmentalize. It's something you do kind of on the side if you get to it. But for me, activism and organizing, the justice work that's at the core of who I am in terms of my values, is deeply intertwined with my teaching and my scholarship. And so, I study social movements. I study the history of people who have spoken truth to power and organized themselves against all odds and have changed the world. And those are the people I'm drawn to in history. And so, I want to say, like, I'm part of history too. You are too. We all are in history now. What will the historians of 100 years from now write about us? Right. So we have a moral responsibility to be engaged in the world. So being an activist, whether it's a community activist around educational equity, I've done a lot of racial justice work, economic justice work, living wage campaigns, other kinds of union activity. I've done a lot of stuff in the LGBTQ space on gender and sexual justice. I've been a peace activist. I've always been a peace activist, always opposed every war in my lifetime. And so as I've emerged and evolved and grown and become as a scholar and historian, as a teacher and an educator, I also have always been doing the work of activism and organizing as well. And to me, those things are braided together. They're not compartmentalized. I'm not a scholar on Tuesday and a teacher on Wednesday and an activist on the weekend, right? Those three things are always swirling in my life. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, but it's never dull.
Oh yeah, not a dull life you have at all. That's Thank you so much. And like the way that you even like structured the different milestones, and then also like from your formative years up to now, you know, in like adulthood and like three pillars. Yeah, such clarity. And so much, of course, and still doing so much as you engage with those in your community, and you know, across such a diversity of groups, all with this common desire to connect and, you know, touch the lives of others, in some ways electrifying them to continue down their own path. And I loved what you said about like the kind of how sacred teaching is. It's not given that kind of stature in society.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, and it's clearly reflected in society and throughout history. But it does, you know, comfort me as a teacher myself, that, you know, I've chosen a profession that's, you know, really needed, but also that it's in some ways like linked to my own kind of it's not just about the students. I mean, it's about the students, but it's also about me. There's this
Yeah.
kind of interconnectedness that I think about as a teacher, that if I'm not learning, how can I expect my students to be learning either? And I think
Right.
you explained that quite well,
Mhm.
with how you approach your classrooms, how you step into the classroom.
Mhm.
So thank you so much for that. And so I think we have a lot that we can kind of dig into just with
Yeah.
this. Um,
Sure.
and you know, I really loved hearing what you shared in the very beginning about your roots, how all of these different factors came together, especially with your family, that led to this moral education. You framed it that way, in many ways, it's like kind of like a compass, right, where it really guided you, and you found yourself in different situations, new environments, and always being tested to see like, well, which direction, right?
Yeah.
You know, as if, you know, you're saying nothing about your life has been straight. So clearly the zigzagging and loop-de-loos and spirals and all that have been important. You know, but one thing that caught my attention, I'd like to hear a little bit more about, if that's all right. You said that you know, you grew up blue collar, right, and then went to a white collar institution like Harvard,
Yeah.
and it was there that you really started, you know, thinking on a maybe perhaps like a deeper, more personal level,
Yeah.
right, being away from the family, about what
Mhm.
does it mean to live a good life. So I'm curious, like, what was the kind of like historical context, which you know, you kind of alluded to, that was very significant, and how did that you know, kind of inform the way in which you were reflecting on this question of like, what does it mean to live a good life? And did you
Yeah.
arrive at any conclusions, or just kind of, I don't know, it's a big question to ask oneself at that like
Yeah.
important time.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned before about teaching. It's not as valued as it should be. Certainly not not compensated the way it should be at any level, particularly in the primary and secondary levels. But I always think like t being an educator, being a teacher, being in education has incredibly high value, even if it's not valued. And that we have to keep very clear in our minds, because the devaluing from a material sensibility or even a social perspective, right, can't get in the way of our sense of a calling, right? That we always have to value what we do, right, and make what we do valuable, regardless of whether or not anyone else does right by us. And that's something I learned early on with my family. And it's interesting because the folks in my family who didn't have a formal education, who didn't finish high school or didn't go to college, they were not hostile to the idea of college or graduate school, right? The folks in my family, my factory worker grandparents, were every bit as fervent about me getting the best kind of education. And I mean, when I got into Harvard, I mean, the whole family sang. I mean, it was a point of enormous collective pride and achievement. It wasn't just me, it was them as well. And then, of course, the folks who had gone to college, who were first and then became educators and teachers themselves, they were very much pushing me to get as good, to be as good a student and to get as good an education. And there was pressure there. I don't want to be too gauzy about it. I'm adopted. I was the only child and only grandchild on both sides. So like, everybody's American dreams were like deposited in me. And so that was a lot to carry. It still is a lot to carry. But I carried it proudly because I came from proud people. And when I think about that transition from a blue collar upbringing to a white collar school, and that's just a shorthand for we weren't fancy people. And then I went to the fanciest of schools, and then I went to Columbia for graduate school. So and I have 4 Ivy League degrees, right? I mean, I get a lot of good, gentle, but consistent ribbing from my family now about how fancy I've become, and it keeps me honest and keeps me true. But there was a pride of purpose. And I never felt that my family, regardless of what they did for work, right, ever felt like they weren't living a life they could be proud of, right, fancy or not. And so that has helped ground me in this as I elevated. My roots and my wings have always been firmly intact. And so when I got to school, and it's interesting because this gets back to kind of history, that I graduated from high school in June of 1993 when the tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. And I started college in the fall of 1989. Graduated high school in 1989, graduated from college in 1993. And think about that time frame, right? So the tanks roll into Tiananmen Square the June of my graduation from high school. In the fall of my freshman year of college, the wall in Berlin comes crumbling down and the sort of Cold War begins to sort of crumble. The fall of my sophomore year, I think, was the first Gulf War in Iraq, and then Nelson Mandela. The spring of my sophomore year, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison after 27 and a half years, and then the LA riots break out in the spring of my junior year. Bill Clinton and Al Gore get elected in 1993, effectively bringing to a close the long Reagan and Bush era. These were world historical times when you're thinking about apartheid and a post-apartheid South Africa, when you're thinking about a Cold War world and a post-Cold War world, when you're thinking about kind of eruptions of race relations and the kinds of fraught tensions that existed socially, politically, culturally, and otherwise in the United States during the 1980s and early 1990s, moving into a different kind of era in the 90s and beyond. I got caught up in that swirl. And that was a time where I realized like what I studied and what I did and who I was and who I was responsible to mattered. And I better figure that out. And so I came to college wanting to study government and economics because I thought I wanted to go to law school and then I'd run for office someday, and my girlfriend and I would marry each other, and someday I'd run for president. That was sort of my little silly dream as a high school kid, even when I was going off to college. And then I got to college and I did a service and social justice orientation for a week where I was doing work in the community. And I met through that upper class folk who were involved in AIDS activism and anti-apartheid work and the student solidarity movement with South Africa and other kinds of things that really drew me in because they were very much aligned with my values. Right. So I ended up going to protests and community actions, solidarity actions before I registered for classes or got a work study job, both of which were very important to my being able to stay at Harvard. And so, that world historical moment of disruption, of revolution, really, those were revolutionary times, right? Like pointed me in a different direction or moved me in a different direction. And so instead of teaching or taking economics and political science, or government, the intro classes, both of which I hated, I started reading literature again and taking African American studies classes and other kinds of things. And then I ended up moving in a very different direction and ended up concentrating in history and literature and African American studies. So my whole intellectual world shifted as the world itself was shifting. And then I was called into all of these other kinds of activities. I went to college as a recruited athlete. I ended up being a community organizer and activist and quitting sports. Right. I went to study government and economics and go to law school, and I ended up studying history, literature, and African American studies and going to get a PhD in that field. Right. And so when I think about those kind of identities that I've become as a scholar, a historian, a teacher, educator, and an activist and organizer, all of that have congealed in a way. All of those things became much more fully formed when I was in college, the whole 4 years. And then when I went to Columbia in New York City to do my PhD, all of that was with me. That was like the sort of luggage that I brought with me to New York when I moved into my apartment in Harlem in the fall of 1993.
Wow, that was amazing. And like in so many different revolutionary events that you pointed out and tied to your own like where were you in history and what was
Yeah.
going on, and I like how you use the word like it was like a swirl of events. Um, you said swirl. In my head, I understood it as like a frenzy because it
Yeah,
just seemed like chaotic. It seemed like
it
um,
was.
nothing was on solid ground, right?
Mhm.
And and so yeah, I mean, I I mean like I was gonna ask you this question, but I feel like it might be, I don't know, not as relevant just because like it just seems like there wasn't one particular event that really just completely shifted. It sounded like with so many things happening, you didn't have time to register it as one defining thing, one global event after the other, just kind of compounding, and then kind of leading you towards this new path or new, direction towards activism, towards, a love of history and trying to understand that. So maybe like I'm sure that as you were going through it, you kind of heard the news and you registered like, oh my gosh, like Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, like what's this new era like?
Yeah.
Um, was there any like particular figure, a friend, a professor, community organizer that kind of guided you in understanding, hey, there's a lot going on, and you know, the path of history of like studying it more might be something you're interested in or you might benefit from? Or yeah, like who would you say like amidst all of the kind of frenzy and the
Yeah.
swirling of it, kind of helped guide you or like anchor you in the new direction that was, then finding yourself over at Columbia and then doing
Yeah.
the PhD in
Yeah.
history?
I think I think there are different ways of thinking about that, like the role, the influences, whether they're mentors in the most intimate or immediate sense of people I knew who guided me as my professors, teachers, or what have you, or people who are just models in the world. I remember watching the scenes of those students standing in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square and being like, those people are brave. Like they're going to get shot. They're going to die for democracy. And I was thinking, my God, I was 17 at the time, just turned 18, I think. And I was thinking, would I be brave enough to do that? I doubt it. At the time, surely not. I'm not sure I would now. I'd hope I would. But I remember being like, whoa, like that's brave. Like those people are about something. And then, of course, Mandela, who was the great figure of my coming of age, certainly, I think for anybody who cared about human rights and social justice and racial justice and multiracial democracy, I mean, Nelson Mandela was a towering figure. And I remember getting up early the day that he came out of the Robben Island prison cell after 27 and a half years. And I don't know that I knew how long he had been in there at the time, but I remember the news coverage of that and watching him and then hearing the speech he gave and the way that he was willing to like maintain the fierceness of his determination and his people's determination for a multiracial democracy in South Africa. And yet and the rage that came with that and the courage that came with that and the tenacity and all of that, but also his like willingness to forgive and to build a different kind of country, right, on the ashes of an authoritarian racist regime that had put him in prison for 27 and a half years. And I'm thinking like, whoa, I definitely don't have all that in me, right? Like, how does this guy, and he was just a representation of so many people, right, who were part of that entire movement, right? And so like when I was looking at those for the Berliners, like the people who tore down the wall because how ridiculous is this wall that divides East and West Berlin because of ideology, and these people tearing it down to create a community of neighbors and then a new country and a new possibility. All of those things like took hold of me. And I was like, these people are brave. I want to be like them when I grow up. But then when I think about more intimately, I got to Harvard and I got out of the car in August of 1989. And the first two people I met were Sandy Dubowski, the award-winning documentary filmmaker, and Jarrett Barrios, who then went on to be the state senator, who one of the people who led the marriage equality fight in Massachusetts, and then went on to be the head of GLAAD and so forth. Sandy was a junior, I believe, and Jarrett was a senior, and they were leaders. And they were both queer, they were both gay, and they were both out and proud and fabulous. And Sandy was this very soft-spoken, kind, gentle Jewish, creative type, almost, he had a kind of philosophical bearing to him. very, very soft spoken. Jarrett was this tall, incredibly charismatic, very handsome. Both of them were beautiful in their own ways. Just this force of nature. And they were both very active in queer politics on campus at a time when very few people were out, certainly not in the way that they were. They were both doing AIDS activism. Jarrett was the student chair of Queer Nation, the chapter in Boston at the time. I now teach a course called Queer Nation, and as a kind of homage to the activist that I was not at that time. I was not out. I was not nearly, I certainly wasn't out proud or anything close to it. But the fact that these were the first two people, and I'm still friends with both of them, that these were the first two people that I encountered when I stepped out of my parents' car from Albany, New York, truck. We had a truck out of the truck from Albany, New York, onto this campus in this fancy place. And the first two people, I mean, we were talking before, there's no concept of coincidence in Buddhism, right? I think a lot about the role of serendipity in history, and I think serendipity can be a form of divinity, right? Like we weren't expecting it. This wasn't part of the plan, but it happened, and it happened for a reason. And I think like that happened for a reason. Like those two people, it could have been any of the upper class folk who met me when I got out of that truck. And yet it was the two of them. It was almost like they were opening a portal into my future and helping guide me. And they were peers, right? They were peers, but they were peers I looked up to. So, like, Nelson Mandela is this like towering global figure. The student activists in Tiananmen Square and the Berliners tearing down the wall, those are people that were like outside my realm of possibility in terms of their bravery, but also like their proximity. I didn't know who they are. I mean, I later did have the honor of meeting Nelson Mandela and one of the activists in Tiananmen Square and some of the people who were involved with the revolution in Berlin and in Germany and in Europe at the time. But that was later on. But these two folks were folks that I was able to have in front of me who were models of what I could do with my Harvard future. And then more broadly, the kind of life I wanted to live. And so when I think about the two of them very fondly, and I've told them both this, I've given them their flowers while they're here. What they did for me, and I don't think they set out to do anything for me. They were just like welcoming me to campus and to this program, the first year urban program. Um, and then later on, I would have advisors, and the most important person for me at Harvard was Robert Coles, who was he taught this great big Gen Ed 105 course called Gen Ed 105, The Literature of Social Reflection. And Coles was, a civil rights activist and a medical doctor, and he was a Pulitzer Prize winning scholar. He wrote a 5-part series on children in crisis, where it started with 2 volumes on Black and white children who were going through desegregation in the South together, as he had been stationed in New Orleans. He was the first person to interview Ruby Bridges, who desegregated the public schools in New Orleans in 1960, where he had been stationed in the military as a military psychiatrist. So like he became a mentor to me. I took his course in the fall of my junior year, and there were a lot of things going on then. That was really the pivot point between my sophomore and junior year, where I started to think about going to a PhD program, think about being a professor. I had really thrown myself fully into activism. I'd quit one of the sports that I played. My Irish grandfather, was sick, and he ended up dying that fall. So there was a lot going on that fall that for me really was a transformative and pivotal moment. And he became a kind of moral guide. Like when I was in his classroom, he would stand on the stage in Sanders Theater in front of 800 or 1,000 students, among which I was one. And he would just tell stories. He'd tell stories about James Baldwin and Martin Luther King and Ruby Bridges and Dorothy Day and George Orwell and all of these, Anna Freud and all of these people. And I was just like, who is this guy? And I remember and he would link all of this stuff. He would link the literature and the language and the history and the politics and the justice and the loneliness. And he would just speak to all of these things and the movements and people. And he took people seriously, and he clearly loved teaching. And I hung on every word. And I remember thinking, I want to be like this when I grow up. I want this guy is what I want to be like if I'm lucky enough to get to where I now think I want to go. So Robert Coles was, in terms of my professor, right, the guy, my moral guide through college. And when I think about him, he was really in many ways the bridge between my parents and my grandparents, my roots. And then in graduate school, when I studied with Eric Foner and Manny Marable and Howard Zinn and others, who became my moral and political and intellectual guides as I became a historian and a professor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, so many different mentor figures, and of course, right, the serendipity of meeting, encountering that
Right.
mentor figure in that particular moment, whether it be someone that was, yeah, close in proximity, welcoming you to Harvard, or just kind of, flashing lights on a television screen of a distant place, with people that, are just kind of strangers, and yet there's like this strong attraction to like what they're doing, why they're doing it, and not realizing how that is literally history in the making. I really love how you kind of spoke about your encounter with the two queer activists and like the peers that you had, that they were like opening a portal to your future by like showing you like this is kind of like well, this is passion, like in an unabashed, raw, like this is my purpose, and kind of, not forcing it upon anyone,
Mm.
other than just them being authentic and true to themselves,
Yeah.
and how
Yeah.
that then, influenced you to continue in your work along your journey to the point where now, when you were talking about Robert Coles and like the kind of way in which he would tell stories and connect them to many, many different things. And I was just thinking, like, wow, like in the class that we just took, that's exactly what you did. I feel like in your own way, you created this web of relations amongst our community and extending that to all of our various different stories that we brought into the class. And it might not have been a stage at Sanders Theater of 800 people, but I mean, in some ways, it's even more impressive that it was online, and that's the future.
Yeah.
So congratulations, because I
Oh.
do feel like mentor figures. There's this sense of wanting those who like like the disciples. That's the phrase that I use. I mean, you might not use it, but in many ways, it's like what the mentor hopes for is for the disciple to rise above even them, right? The whole standing on the
Yeah.
shoulders of giants, kind of phrasing. I think that's what we see in history, how it plays out. So yeah, so thank you so much. I wanted to ask
Thank
this
you.
question.
That means a lot to me that you said what you just said. So thank you very much.
Course. Yeah, no, I mean every word of it. And you mentioned about like Nelson Mandela, kind of how incredibly brave he was. And that's just one descriptor, right? It's so many other things about,
Right.
the actions that he took, his ability to, forgive, his ability to channel rage in a way that was needed and productive and groundbreaking, revolutionary, and the hope that all of that created. And so all of that, serves as like it serves a point, and like how do you understand this notion of like what does it mean to be brave? And again, tying it back to the recent course, right? There's a whole course that you've been teaching for many, many years now about
Yeah.
what does it mean to do brave communication. So I'm curious, like, could you
Mm.
share a little bit about what you mean by brave communication, but then also tie that into this notion of like maybe what does it mean to be a global citizen? I feel like there's some interesting connecting points that you might be able to kind of guide us through.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, lots of people have different ways of thinking about courage, but I mean, I and bravery. I mean, I think that bravery in its public manifestation is the capacity to push through the constraints that are, or, whether they're obstacles or, practical considerations or whatever, through to do and say something bigger than you might do otherwise and say otherwise. And so, speaking up in a meeting, right? Offering critical feedback to someone who has more power or privilege than you in something, right? Denouncing something, calling something out, making a big demand about social problems or prejudices. And so I think there are lots of public manifestations of bravery and courage. I think Mandela and the principles of the South African freedom movement represent a kind of supersized, a particularly bold and big manifestation of bravery. But I wouldn't want us only to think that starts and ends there, because I think everyone needs a portal into a braver life. And sometimes that starts with like sending a letter to someone that you're having a conflict with, or extending some kind of gesture of kindness to someone who needs it when you're in a hurry, right? Or giving someone the last $5 you have in your wallet because they're hungry, right? And I mean, that's bravery too. And so there are lots of ways that we can be brave. And I don't think that we can choose the sort of smaller manifestations of that or the bigger ones. And it's one or the other. It can be all of those things over a lifetime at different points. But I also think that there is a more private and more intimate kind of bravery that is about self-reflection and introspection and criticism, right? The willingness to look yourself really hard in the mirror every day and contend with what you see. I talk to students about, or people about the toothbrush test, right? At the very least, we brush our teeth in the morning and at the end of the day. And, we're usually in the mirror when we're doing that. And so when we're in the morning, we're like getting ready for our day, we're brushing our teeth. Like, what are we looking at? What are we looking forward to? Right? What goals are we setting for ourselves? Like, how do we want to live our life that day? And then at the end, we got to reckon with what just happened, right? We got to say, all right, did I live up to all that stuff? Did I make compromises, right? Did I pull a punch, right? Did I mistreat someone? And so I think there's a lot of bravery that happens that we never see, right? Bravery, like people who go to therapy, right? After a long time of not going to therapy. I think going to therapy and working through things that are difficult or traumatic or that get in the way of our full flourishing, right? That's bravery. And no one has to know about any of that, right? Writing in a journal, right? Being able to make pledges to yourself every day, daily kind of meditations or affirmations, right? And this is what I think a lot of mindfulness practice is about, right? Of sort of getting in touch with yourself and of your body and of the earth or your space or your surroundings in order to develop a deeper kind of alignment or interconnection. That too, I think, is bravery. And so and I actually think in some ways that the big bravery of like a social movement leader or principle, right, also has to entail and come with the more intimate and personal or private kind of bravery of introspection, criticism, and elsewhere. I mean, you tell me, Nelson Mandela spent 27 and a half years in that prison. He had a lot of private time. He had a lot of time with himself, and he helped to lead a movement from prison, and certainly being in prison made him a martyr and a model, right? And people were able to draw inspiration from it. But I guarantee you that part of Nelson Mandela's ability to continue to have hope and resilience, right? And manifest forgiveness and think hard about what it means to build something that had never existed in his country before, or even in the world before, required an enormous amount of brave introspection and so forth. And so I think there's a world where we can combine those things with community, right? In the most kind of proximate sense. And that's one of the things I think we're trying to do in the class, right? Is we take all of you, our individuals who bring whatever you bring to the space. And then within that space, we ask you to do some deep digging and to do some introspection and self-criticism and reflection. And this happens every time you give a speech and every time you get feedback, but also hopefully every time you have to prepare something. And that then becomes part of the larger community building with your peers and with me and the teaching team, right? And then we can build something that is beyond ourselves, that's collective and oriented around community that never existed before in quite that form. And then we're able to draw safety and strength from that community and that support and that feedback and that criticism, the holding to account, we're accountable to each other. Then we do things that are bigger and braver. And then once we've done that, we're able to go out into the world and do things that are bigger and braver. And so for me, there's an interconnection between the kind of individual and the community and the globe or the larger realm, or what we might call the kind of the private and then kind of the intermediary and then the public kinds of layers. And a number of people have talked about global citizenship in similar ways, right? This idea that there's a local, it's where we're situated, where we live and do our work and love and all the things we do on a daily basis. Then there's for most people, there's a national, right? There's a nation state or some kind of national formation that they are derive their first citizenship from in many cases. And then there's the global, right? This larger, idea of citizenship as a kind of connection and responsibility to not just people who live in all sorts of parts of the world, but to the earth itself, the planet itself in that way. So I think like thinking about bravery or thinking about citizenship or moral responsibility, which is actually part of both of those things, it requires us to think on multiple levels and layers and then to weave them together in some kind of tapestry.
Yeah, wow, thank you. I really found it so helpful the way that you spoke about bravery, spoke about courage in the context of like what does bravery mean and all of its, nuances that there's the public, kind of scale, but there's and in some ways more importantly, the more intimate and personal kind of reflection that comes, or the introspection that comes with being able to confront oneself in that particular moment. I think it's needed. It's something that most people brush off
Yeah.
or kind of put to the side. And speaking of brushes, the toothbrush test was also, I never heard of it in that way. Like it's so clear. Like, hopefully most people brush their teeth in the morning and in evening times. But I think it's a kind of a moment of reckoning where you can start the day with this sense of hope, optimism. What do you want to achieve? And then ending it with, yeah, kind of recalling what you did, but also a sense of gratitude. Like, hey, you made it through the
Right.
day. Like
Got
you're
one more day,
alive.
right? Right,
Yeah,
right.
that's like that's
I mean,
good.
there's a gratitude both at the end of the day and the beginning of the day. I mean, gratitude, like I got up, like, all right, one more chance at this, and then or another chance at this, and then gratitude at the end of the day, like got me through, right? I got through that, and I did what I had to do. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to downplay the fact that bravery also requires people to step up and speak out and take a stand and show up, right? I mean, I think that there is that piece of it can't be lost either, right? I mean, it's one, if you're constantly engaged in self-criticism and you're going to therapy and you're journaling and you're meditating and you're doing all of that stuff that no one ever sees, that's fine, right? And that's important, and I would recommend it to anyone, and I'm trying to do a better job of all those things myself. But we also have to show up, right, in solidarity with people who are struggling. We also need to speak up in the face of injustice. We also need to take risks and embrace whatever consequences flow from that. As you know from the class, like one of the elements of the brave communication and leadership framework is being very clear about acknowledging and assessing risks and consequences, right? That being brave is going to on some level entail a risk. In the most private sense, it's a risk that you might actually have to confront something that is hard to confront in yourself. And in the grander, more public sense, it might mean that you piss off your boss, or you might put your job on the line, or you might be at risk to go to prison or jail, right? Be arrested in some way, or feel the sanctioning of or suppression of the state, right? And so these things come with all different kinds of risks and consequences. But I think risks and consequence and acknowledging and being very clear about what those risks are, and then also being willing to say, hey, if I lose my job, so be it. If this person stops talking to me, so be it. If I'm going to be arrested and go to jail for my beliefs, for nonviolent civil disobedience or what have you, so be it. And not everybody makes those decisions. I mean, if everyone were brave, we wouldn't have a category called brave, right? And so what does it mean to become braver
Mm,
than we are right now? And that requires you both to have a very clear sense about what your values are and what your standards are for yourself so that you can hold yourself accountable to your own stuff. And it requires us to say, you know what, this is wrong. And I have to say something about this. And hopefully other people will join me. But at the end of the day, in order for me to feel good about myself in the private space, I have to do this in the public one.
I 100% agree. And I find that again, this conversation about the importance of bravery, how that looks like, how we show up for ourselves and for others, and kind of, make decisions based on our core values to really leave this imprint on society that hopefully is for the better. And yeah, just kind of continuing to be guided by our own sense of purpose. I think it's
Yeah,
so important, and it really ties into global citizenship. I think, courage, bravery is just so needed,
yeah,
and kind of serves as in some ways, a kind of like anchoring of like, I will not be swayed by my environment, like
right,
I can act upon the environment in a way that, maybe for others, they might find it too difficult,
right,
but it's worth it, right? Again, because like if it was easy, then then what
right.
the world would be very, very different in how it's like organized. But it's just, yeah, I was just thinking about that a little. Um, okay, so this has been so amazing. I've been enjoying this conversation so much, but we are unfortunately coming to the end. And I like to close my conversations with guests with a pretty, simple question. It's in regards to a book or a movie
Mm,
recommendation. It could be something that you've read or watched recently, or something that you continuously come back to. But in the context of our conversation today, what would you recommend for our listeners to look up and maybe like tie to global citizenship?
yeah, yeah. Whew. So I very recently, I mean, I think art in all of its manifestations, murals, public art, theater, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, journalism, documentary filmmaking, other kinds of filmmaking, these song, certainly music, dance, all of these forms of art and artistic expression are important, I think, as connective tissue for our common humanity. I always say that stories and all of those forms, all of those genres of art tell stories, right? Whether they're visual stories or sonic stories or stories in word and print, that we are at our most human when we allow those things to flow across barriers of difference, of nationhood, of borders, and they make us better. And they because they invite us in, right? They can delight us and inspire us and spark joy and also challenge us and critique us and um, force a kind of reckoning. Right? There are all these things that art does. I just saw a play at the American Repertory Theater here in Cambridge, and I'm on the board of the ART, and the ART is this remarkable theater, many Tony Award winning productions and artistic creations, and the way that we talk about art is the ART expands the boundaries of theater and what is possible on stage and in the world. And I just saw a musical adaptation of Real Women Have Curves, which was a movie starring America Ferrera earlier on, and the story is of a group of women, many of whom are undocumented, from different Latin, Central American countries. There's Mexican American folks and folks from El Salvador and so forth. And most of them are undocumented. And it centers around this family, which is a mixed status family. The youngest daughter was born in the United States and is therefore a US citizen. And the mother and the daughter and the father have mixed status. And so the older daughter is a garment worker, but she also has aspirations to become a fashion designer. And so she works in a clothing factory and they make dresses. And so this story, which is just beautifully centered in all of the women who make these dresses, who have mixed status themselves, and it's a joyful, beautiful, brilliantly performed musical that just makes your heart swell. But it also layers on top of that all sorts of issues of migration and detention and the surveillance state and the police state and the precarity of folks who are undocumented and the raids on the sweatshops and all of these different kinds of things. And so there's all of this political stuff and social stuff that's so current, and yet this is a movie I think that came out in the 80s. It's centered in the 80s, so I mean this is almost 40 years old, or maybe even more, and yet it speaks directly to our time right now, and I think will speak directly to our time for the foreseeable future. And so it transcends history in that sense, and yet it's also very historically specific. And it's about a group of Latino women, right, who work making dresses, which is not everybody's identity or experience, and yet it's just I was like bursting with tears and laughter, and related so much to so much was going on, and yet the people on stage were not. I wasn't seeing myself on stage, but I was feeling an experience that I could relate to, a kind of familiar difference. And the whole title is a double entendre, right? Real women have curves. So they were women who themselves, in terms of their bodies, have curves. And then life throws women, and these women in particular, curves. And so, that's the kind of art that can expand the imagination and connect us across lines of difference, and in this case, even borders and boundaries of history. And I think all art does that, or has the capacity at its best to do that. One of the forms or genres that I constantly go back to, in addition to theater, which is kind of my favorite kind of art, is documentary film. And the Oscar nominations just came out this morning, and one of the things I'm always curious to see is the nominations for documentary film. And I always try to watch them because mostly they're often from other countries, documenting things that go unseen by mainstream journalists and politicians and other kinds of forces. And so sometimes documentary film is the only representation of a story that is otherwise invisible or erased from the public record. And so we as consumers, as witnesses, I prefer to use the term witness than consumer because I'm not a capitalist, we witness the lives and the stories that these filmmakers are able to curate and to then transport, right, to other audiences in other parts of the world. Because to be a global citizen doesn't necessarily mean that you have to travel everywhere, which requires money and other kinds of things, or that you have to be in a place with the people to understand and to appreciate and to demonstrate a connection or solidarity and empathy with them. And so film, I think, documentary film in particular, but art more broadly, I think has the capacity to do that in a way that very few other things do. But at the center of all of this is the power of storytelling, as I think the most sacred human form of communication.
Wow, beautifully said. And thank you so much for those recommendations from theater to documentary film, and yeah, and how you were able to speak about these forms of art as pushing boundaries, as expanding our imagination, or in some ways, for a lot of people, like kind of rekindling one's imagination because of how
Right.
stifling things can be in
Yeah.
day-to-day life, and how narrow-minded, kind of in our own little tunnel we kind of just pursue, and so art serves a really important purpose in
Yeah.
expanding, and opening up, and so yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, and I like the tip about the what was it this morning there was the Oscars, I always get those.
Oh yeah. So
Yeah,
the Oscar nominations came
yeah,
out this morning. We
yeah.
watched them. We're big. My husband and I are big movie, but him especially. He's I think in another life he'd be a filmmaker and I'd be a playwright. We're both educators, so it's okay. We're still living decent lives, but he loves film, and so we watched the Oscar nominations this morning. So thinking about these films and documentaries in particular is top of mind.
Yeah, and no, but that's a great tip though, just to kind of like find like a curated list, right? And that's
Right.
updated right from year to year. So thank you so
Yeah.
much, Tim. This has been such a lovely and insightful, and very passionate conversation about stories, your stories, but then so many other individuals from different historical periods, and then currently continuing with your work in as a teacher, as an activist. And it's just been just amazing to hear it all kind of come together in this unique, way. And yeah, and I just want to give the last word, like any closing remarks that you'd like, as we kind of, wrap up this conversation.
No, just thank you, Scott, and thank you for taking the time to curate these conversations and these dialogues. I mean, what you're doing is you're creating space for people to share stories, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. And so you're doing that work. This is its own brave space for the sharing of stories, which connects us all. And there's nothing about that that's going to hurt the world. You know, we're in a world that's in desperate need of connection and understanding and conversation, empathy, right, as a way to get to a place of peace and harmony and joy and justice and love. And you're doing that work too. So anytime I see someone who does that work, I want to affirm it and celebrate it and lift it up. And then also, if I get invited to be part of it, like you did with me for this, I always say yes because I want to be part of that work too. So thanks for the space.
Thank you so much.